Victoria Kahn. We're very glad to have. She is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley, and she is really a world-class specialist in Renaissance literature, political theory, and rhetoric, among other things. And she's also currently Fulbright visiting professor here at YZG in the Department of Western Language and Literature. And she will lecture today on Machiavelli's The Prince. So why don't we welcome her. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, I want to know whether the mic is working. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Good. Okay, so please raise your hand if I'm speaking too quickly. Today we're going to talk about Niccolo Machiavelli, the most famous political theorist in the West. In Machiavelli's time, Aristotle and Plato were the most famous political theorists. Today, Machiavelli is. So I'm going to try to explain in this lecture how this happened and why Machiavelli is revolutionary in the history of political thought. I'm going to focus on two aspects of his work, the two great contributions that explain why he is such an important figure in the history of Western political thought. The first point I'm going to make is that he was the first political thinker to introduce a realistic analysis of politics into the Western tradition. And the second point is that he was the first political thinker to argue that if you analyze the realm of politics realistically, you will see that the republic is the best form of government. So let me begin by saying a little bit about the period in which Machiavelli lived, the Renaissance, and then I'll say a little bit about Machiavelli's life. The term Renaissance is a term given to the historical period of about 1350 to 1650 in Europe. In French, where the term comes from, Renaissance means rebirth. And it refers in particular to the rebirth of interest in ancient Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, and art. And it refers to the explosion of cultural creativity in Europe that resulted from its encounter with these ancient works. The people who participated in the Renaissance were the educated elite, not the average person on the street. This was because Latin was the language of scholarship, and most important works were written in Latin rather than in the national languages of English, French, Italian, Spanish, etc. But very few people could read Latin. In fact, it's fair to say that very few people could read their own vernacular languages. So the Renaissance was first and foremost an elite movement. During the Renaissance, as I've said, there was a renewed interest in the art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. This renewed interest is explained in part by the discovery of previously unknown works that had been hidden away in monastery libraries for centuries. This is true of Lucretius. It's also true of some ancient Latin works. There was also a revival of interest in Greek literature. This was because people began to study the language of ancient Greek for the first time since antiquity. And this meant that they could now read the literature and philosophy of ancient Greece as well as ancient Rome in the original language. But the Renaissance did not just happen because there were more ancient works available, although this was very important. It also happened because the art and literature and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome were admired in new ways. Many of these works had been known in the Middle Ages, but Renaissance readers approached them from an entirely different perspective. In particular, Renaissance readers had a much stronger appreciation of the historical difference between their own time and that of antiquity than had people in the Middle Ages. Renaissance readers began to think that the ancient works of literature and philosophy, including Homer and Plato, Virgil and Cicero, were more beautiful, more eloquent, and more profound about human life than anything in their own culture. And this is fairly remarkable because their own culture was Christian and ancient culture was pagan. But they started to value the works of ancient culture more than the works of their own Christian period. Like his contemporaries, Machiavelli was also fascinated with antiquity. And so he was very much a participant in the Renaissance. But unlike his contemporaries, he was not primarily interested in literary and philosophical works, which he thought were too removed from the world of politics and everyday life. He preferred to read the ancient historians. The figures he admired were founders of states and military heroes, figures such as Romulus, the founder of ancient Rome, or Alexander the Great. So Machiavelli was part of the Renaissance in his enthusiasm for the ancients, but he also departed from the usual view of which ancients you should read. Whereas his contemporaries sought new ideals of beauty and eloquence in the ancients, Machiavelli read the ancients, in particular the ancient historians, in order to learn about realism in politics. Okay, so now let me turn to Machiavelli's life. Machiavelli was born in Florence, Italy in 1486, and he died in 1527, so he didn't have an incredibly long life. He had a good education, he could read and write Latin very well, and he eventually became a government official. Italy at this time was not yet a nation-state. Instead, it was divided into smaller states called city-states. Most of these city-states were ruled by tyrants or princes. That is, people who came to power either because they had inherited the throne or because they had taken it by force. And all political power in these city-states was concentrated in their hands. But Florence, where Machiavelli lived, was an exception, and this is very important. For much of Machiavelli's life, Florence was a republic, which at the time meant that it had a government that was led by rich and prominent members of society, but which also gave some power to the people. Machiavelli felt strongly that the Republican form of government was the best form of government. It was superior to life under a tyrant or a prince. And in fact, as an adult, Machiavelli worked as a secretary and diplomat for the Florentine government when it was a republic. But in 1512, a powerful family named the Medici took over in Florence and replaced the Republican form of government with a government of princes. The Medici thought that Machiavelli had been part of a conspiracy against them, and so they had Machiavelli tortured and sent into exile on his farm outside of Florence. And this is basically where Machiavelli spent the rest of his life. It was on his farm that he wrote his great works of political theory. The Prince, which he wrote around 1513, and therefore we are now celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Prince, and the Discourses of 1519. I'm going to focus on the Prince in the rest of this lecture. First, I want to talk about the situation in which Machiavelli wrote the book. Second, I'll talk about Machiavelli's realistic analysis of politics in the Prince, and then I'll talk about his argument in favor of republicanism. So the Prince was written, as I said, in 1513, and it was addressed to a member of the Medici family. This might seem strange, since, as I just mentioned, the Medici had tortured Machiavelli. But Machiavelli was desperate for employment after he was banished from government, and he made several efforts to get the Medici to hire him. They were all unsuccessful. It was quite typical at the time to seek employment by dedicating an important work to a potential patron. And since the Medici were princes, Machiavelli decided to write a manual of advice to princes and dedicate it to one of them. So now I want to turn to the content of The Prince, to Machiavelli's contribution to political theory, and specifically to his realistic approach to politics. To understand why Machiavelli's realism was so revolutionary and subversive, you really have to know something about previous writers about politics. The main point that I want to make here is that all earlier writers who wrote formal works of political theory emphasized that the ruler had to be a good man, a man who was virtuous. In antiquity, the virtues that the ruler should have were qualities such as justice, wisdom, fortitude, temperance, generosity, and clemency. For Christian writers, the ideal ruler should also be virtuous, but they emphasized those qualities that were associated with Christ. Not only goodness, wisdom, and truthfulness, but also patience, peacefulness, and humility. Plato, who, as you know, was one of the greatest ancient Greek political theorists, said that the ruler should know what was good and act according to justice. Ideally, according to Plato, the great ruler would be a philosopher who put his wisdom in the service of the state. Aristotle said that the ruler should have the qualities of temperance, justice, and greatness of mind. The medieval Christian theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas, tried to combine Aristotle and Christianity, and so he argued that the ruler should show a combination of classical and Christian virtues. This approach continued into the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. The instruction manuals for rulers stressed that the good ruler was a father to his people and ruled by virtue rather than by force. The good ruler is portrayed as exercising justice and clemency, as being generous to his people, as looking after their welfare, and setting an example of virtuous and religious behavior. Okay, so now let's turn to Machiavelli and see how radically his approach differs. Let me pause and look at the outline for a second. I'll come back to that. So, Machiavelli's most famous statement of his contribution to political theory, his own view of his revolutionary, realistic approach to politics, appears in chapter 15 of The Prince. If you have your text with you, this is on the first page of chapter 15. It remains now to be seen what style and principles a prince ought to adopt in dealing with his subjects and friends. I know this subject has been treated frequently before, and I'm afraid people will think me rash for trying to do so again, especially since I intend to differ in this discussion from what others have said, and indeed from what everyone else in history has said. But since I intend to write something useful to an understanding reader, it seemed better to go after the real truth, the Italian phrase is la verità effettuale, than to repeat what people have imagined. A great many people have imagined states and princedoms such as nobody ever saw or knew in the real world. For there's such a difference between the way we really live and the way we ought to live, that the man who neglects the real to study the ideal will learn to accomplish his ruin, not his salvation. Any man who tries to be good all the time is bound to come to ruin among the great number of people who are not good. Hence, a prince who wants to keep his post, that is, who wants to stay in power, must learn how not to be good and use that knowledge or refrain from using it as necessity requires. So in this famous passage, Machiavelli contrasts ideal republics such as the one described by Plato in the Republic, to his own description of politics. He tells us that he is after the real truth, or veritas effettuale, the effective truth about politics. Veritas effettuale is an odd phrase. We don't usually associate truth with what works. Truth is usually understood as a kind of knowledge, and what works is a matter of action or behavior. But in politics, Machiavelli tells us, what is true is what works. He then goes even further and says that in politics, being good doesn't always work. A prince who wants to keep his post must learn how not to be good. In other words, being bad is good in politics. This is the truth about politics. So you can begin to see here why the book is so important to the history of political theory. Machiavelli is the first political theorist to say that politics has nothing to do with virtue. Realistically, if you want to succeed in politics, you have to be willing to lie, cheat, steal, murder, or worse. These may be vices from an ethical point of view, Machiavelli says, but from a political point of view, they work. So Machiavelli is pragmatic and realistic in contrast to his predecessors, who are idealistic and, in his view, very naive. Okay, so how do we see this realism at work in The Prince? There are several ways in which this realism is evident. First, as I mentioned before, The Prince was Machiavelli's effort to get a job. Machiavelli pragmatically put aside his hatred of the Medici, who had tortured him, because now they were in power, and he wanted employment. The next thing to note about The Prince is that it is written in Italian. At the time Machiavelli was writing, as I mentioned before, most serious books were written in Latin. So Machiavelli's writing in Italian, the language of everyday conversation, was also a sign of his realism. He was not interested in writing a work of philosophy or of scholarship. He wanted to speak the language that princes spoke in real life, and he wanted to reach a wide audience. The next thing we should note, although this doesn't appear in your translation, is that the chapters in The Prince have titles in Latin. These titles, so the titles are in Latin, the text is in Italian. These titles sound a lot like the chapter titles in traditional, medieval, and Renaissance manuals about how to be a good ruler. Machiavelli's chapters have titles like How a Prince Should Keep His Word, and Of Those Things for Which Princes Are Praised or Blamed. And in Latin, they sound like they're going to recommend virtuous behavior, such as keeping your word and acting well toward your subjects. But these Latin chapter titles in The Prince are really a joke, because Machiavelli's attitude toward the traditional medieval advice manuals to rulers is completely ironic and subversive. What Machiavelli is really saying with these chapter titles is that he alone offers a useful, that is, realistic account of how a prince should act. But the best example of how Machiavelli subverts the traditional manual of princes is in his use of the Italian word virtù. So virtù is up there. Let's see, virtù, right there, with a little accent on it. This is the central concept in The Prince, and it is hugely important for understanding Machiavelli's realistic approach to politics. Virtù in Italian can mean moral virtue, but Machiavelli departs from this meaning and uses the term to mean cunning, strength, ability, cleverness, force, power, or skill. So this presents somewhat of a challenge to the translator who needs to decide what Machiavelli means in every case. And I think the best English translations of The Prince simply would use the term virtue or virtù instead of trying to decide. In every case of these possible meanings, cunning, strength, ability, etc., in every case, Machiavelli substitutes an amoral meaning of virtù for a moral meaning of virtue. Unlike traditional morality, virtù is the ability to respond to the occasion or moment, or what Machiavelli calls fortune, and use it to your advantage. The amoral flexibility of virtù, in other words, is at the heart of Machiavelli's realism about politics. In redefining virtue as virtù, Machiavelli tells us that morality and politics are two entirely different things. But he also wants us to notice that he's doing it because he takes a word that did mean virtue in traditional Italian and uses it in a more subversive way. Machiavelli's realism and his idea of virtù are also demonstrated by his many examples in the text. Most of his examples are about ancient or modern politicians, soldiers, or rulers who seized power and ruled by means of cunning, force, and fraud. There are no saints, angels, or moral heroes in The Prince. There are no religious precepts or teachings. God is rarely mentioned, and then only ironically. In fact, the individuals that Machiavelli focuses on and tells us are exemplary are in many ways a very unattractive group by any standards. You really wouldn't want any of them as your friends, and you certainly wouldn't want them as your ruler. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they engage in murder, and worse. What they do have going for them is that they rise to political power and hold on to their power for as long as possible. This ability is what Machiavelli calls virtù. So let me give just one example of political realism and the exercise of virtù. This is the most famous example in The Prince. It is the example of Cesare Borgia in chapter 7. Borgia, let me say a little bit about who he was. Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI. So popes in those days had many children. He was the kind of ruler that Machiavelli had in mind when he was writing The Prince. Borgia was not a hereditary, lawful ruler. Instead, he seized power by force in a part of northern Italy called the Romagna, with the help of his father and French mercenary troops. So his father, Alexander VI, provided money, and the French mercenary troops provided force. When Machiavelli was a diplomat for Florence, he met Borgia, and we know from Machiavelli's diplomatic correspondence that he sent back to the rulers of Florence that he admired Borgia tremendously. So it makes sense that Machiavelli includes him as an example in The Prince. So how did Borgia behave? Machiavelli is very explicit that Borgia holds onto power by trickery and murder. He invites his rivals to dinner, and he has them all killed. He also kills his lieutenant, a man named Ramiro de Orco, who had helped him establish political order and power in the Romagna. So this is towards the middle or end of chapter 7, the example of Ramiro de Orco. To establish peace and reduce the land to obedience, Borgia decided that good government was needed. And he named Messer Ramiro de Orco a cruel and vigorous man to whom he gave absolute powers. In short order, this man pacified and unified the whole district, winning thereby great renown. But then the Duke, that is to say Borgia, decided such excessive authority was no longer necessary and feared it might become odious or hateful. So he set up a civil court in the middle of the province with an excellent judge and representatives from each city. And because he knew that the recent harshness had generated some hatred, in order to clear the minds of the people and gain them over to his cause completely, he determined to make plain that whatever cruelty had occurred had come not from him, but from the brutal character of his minister. Taking a proper occasion, therefore, he had him placed on the public square of Cesena one morning in 2 pieces, with a piece of wood beside him, which was the traditional symbol of justice, and a bloody knife. The ferocity of the scene left the people at once stunned and satisfied. So they were stunned, they were subdued by this brutal act of seeing Ramiro de Orco cut in half and left in a bloody state in the middle of the square, and they were satisfied by the fact that this theatrical display showed that revenge had been taken on this brutal man. Here Borgia illustrates Machiavelli's view that the ruler who wants to hold on to power needs to be crafty and he needs to use brutality strategically. Brutality and violence are part of the prince's toolkit. What's revolutionary about this is Machiavelli's completely matter-of-fact attitude toward the brutal realities of politics. There's no moral virtue here, and there's no moral lesson. Ramiro is not being punished because he disobeyed Borgia. To the contrary, he is murdered because he has served his purpose, and because by murdering him, Borgia can disguise the fact that he, Borgia, is the one who is really responsible for the cruelty and violence. Examples like this are everywhere in The Prince. And again, the point is, don't be naive about politics. You can pretend to be morally virtuous if it is useful to you, but mostly you will need to be crafty, dishonest, and violent. Okay, so I now want to turn from Machiavelli's realism to Machiavelli's republicanism. I said at the beginning of the lecture that Machiavelli's 2 revolutionary contributions to political thought were his realistic analysis of politics and his argument that if you think about politics realistically, you will end up favoring republicanism. There are at least 2 places in The Prince where we can see this argument about republicanism. In chapter 8, which is the chapter right after the chapter about Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli says, if you want to hold onto your power for longer than Borgia did, because Borgia only ruled the Romagna for a short period, it is necessary to moderate your violence and take into account the interests of your subjects. Machiavelli recommends in this chapter what he calls a civil principality. And this is a principality which gives much more power to the people than a regular principality. A civil principality is on the way to being a republic. So there's just a slight suggestion in chapter 8, but if you read it carefully, you'll see that Machiavelli is recommending moderating tyrannical behavior and catering to the interests of the people if you want to hold on to your power. An earlier example appears in chapter 5. Machiavelli says it's easier to take over a country that has been enslaved than one that has had the experience of freedom in a republic, especially one that has had the experience recently. This passage reads as a coded message to the Medici, who you remember have just helped destroy the Florentine Republic and have reinstated the rule of a prince. So in Florence, at the time that Machiavelli is writing, the Florentines have recently had a long experience of a republican form of government, and they are now living under the rule of princes, that is to say, the Medici. And this is what Machiavelli writes in chapter 5. So you have to imagine the Medici reading this paragraph. Anyone who becomes master of a city, accustomed to living in liberty, and does not destroy it, may expect to be destroyed by it. Because such a city has as a good excuse for rebellion its experience of liberty and ancient institutions, neither of which is ever forgotten because of the passing of time. So no matter how much time has passed, people do not forget the experience of living in freedom or living in a republic. When cities or regions are accustomed to living under a prince, they are, as a result, hesitant in taking up arms, and a prince can win them over. But in republics, greater vitality, greater hatred, and greater desire for revenge against the new prince who destroyed their republic exist. The memory of ancient liberty does not and cannot allow them to rest. If you were a member of the Medici family, this paragraph might make you very nervous, and perhaps it's no surprise that the Medici did not hire Machiavelli. Machiavelli ends this paragraph by saying that the solution to this dilemma is either to destroy such a city altogether, to make sure that they don't rebel against you, or to go live there. The second option is precisely what the Medici themselves did. They returned and lived in Florence. But it seems impossible not to hear a more subversive message, which is that the memory of freedom under a republic is a powerful force, more powerful than the force of a tyrant, and that the Medici, if they want to hold on to their power, will need to allow Florence to return to its republican ways. This message was not heard by the Medici. So let me sum up a little bit at this point. Machiavelli takes a traditional genre, the Manual of Princes, which typically taught the prince how to be virtuous, and he turned it upside down. He recommended violence and deception, murder and treachery, virtue rather than virtue. In doing so, Machiavelli not only took issue with Christianity, but also with the classical emphasis on the virtues that we find in Plato and Aristotle. So Machiavelli, in the history of Western political thought, stands for the separation of ethics from politics and the separation of religion from politics. He stands for what is sometimes called the autonomy of politics. Politics is first and foremost a matter of power, including the power of spectacle and drama, as in the case of Borgia's staging the murder of Ramiro de Orco, which you remember left the people stunned and satisfied. So this is a kind of theatrical coup that Borgia performs. So Machiavelli brings political theory down from the clouds, out of the realm of moral abstraction. He doesn't simply declare that politics should be ethical. Instead, he says politics is first and foremost a matter of power, including the power of drama and illusion. Okay, so I now want to talk a little bit about the reception of Machiavelli. That is, how Machiavelli was read in the Renaissance and how he's read and understood now. In the 16th century, Machiavelli was almost immediately associated with the devil. He was associated with Satan, with pure evil and immorality because of his recommendations of force and fraud, violence and murder. So you can see that in a Christian culture, the kinds of things that Machiavelli recommended sounded not only subversive, but positively satanic, positively diabolical. This interpretation of Machiavelli had a huge afterlife in plays written in the Renaissance, where villains speak the language of Machiavelli. They talk about force and fraud, deception and illusion. This is the figure we call the Machiavel, and the best example is Iago in Shakespeare's Othello. But we can also think of Barabbas in Marlowe's Jew of Malta, or Marlowe's Tamburlaine, or Shakespeare's Richard III. So all of these characters are Machiavels. They're all conniving, they're all deceptive, they're all highly aware of the uses of fraud and, in particular, theatrical spectacle. Even the actor figure in the Renaissance is a kind of Machiavel because he is a shapeshifter. He's a protean figure who can take on different forms. But even in the Renaissance, some readers rejected the identification of Machiavelli with Satan. These readers actually appreciated what Machiavelli had to say about politics. So there are many commentaries on Machiavelli in the Renaissance where people say, finally, we have a realistic analysis of politics. And they appreciated as well Machiavelli's defense of republicanism. This Machiavelli, the realistic Republican thinker, was hugely influential on 17th century English revolutionaries who fought the Civil War against Charles I. So this was a hugely important moment in English history in the 17th century where a legitimate king, Charles I, was dethroned and executed by revolutionaries who took as their inspiration, at least in part, the teachings of Machiavelli. They thought that Charles I was a tyrant, they overthrew him, and they executed him. Machiavelli, the realistic and Republican thinker, was also hugely influential on the French and American revolutions. The founding fathers, the writers of the American Constitution, had all read Machiavelli, and they thought of him as an astute analysis of politics, as a Republican thinker, and as someone who understood the necessary balance of power between the well-to-do and the average person. Some of the Renaissance readers who defended Machiavelli argued that because he was really a Republican thinker, Machiavelli's book, The Prince, must be a satire. In other words, posed the problem of how could a Republican thinker write The Prince? I've mentioned that there are Republican moments in The Prince, but you have to see that the vast majority of the book is advice to how to be a prince or a tyrant. So the question is, how could Machiavelli write The Prince? And these defenders of Machiavelli said the prince must really be a satire, specifically a satirical exposure of how tyrants rule, a satirical exposure of the tricks that tyrants use to oppress their subjects. These readers argued that Machiavelli, for example, did not intend to recommend Borgia's behavior, but only to describe it and implicitly to criticize it. And this interpretation of The Prince as a satire has its 20th century and 21st century defenders as well. And these defenders look at the example of Borgia and they say, well, in the end, Borgia died before he was able to bring his ambition to complete fruition. So Borgia is really a failed example in the end, and Machiavelli must really have been intending it as a satire. Most scholars, however, now think that The Prince was intended as serious advice. Most scholars do not read The Prince as a satire. They read it as serious political advice about how to pragmatically succeed in government, and they believe that this is perfectly compatible with Machiavelli's republicanism. Even though Machiavelli makes it clear that he prefers republics to monarchies or to principalities, he basically advises the same tactics in both forms of government. For both princes and republics, Machiavelli recommends cunning and deception, and the brutal use of force when it is necessary. For both, he recommends the use of religion to intimidate the people or to inspire them to be more militant. In both cases, he complains about the classical and Christian emphasis on moral virtue, and in both, he tells us that virtue is an irrelevant standard in political life. So I want to conclude, and I see that we'll have a little bit of time for questions. I want to conclude with a word about the revolutionary Machiavelli. Nowadays, at least in the United States, and perhaps here in Turkey as well, there are lots of books that pretend to give you Machiavellian advice about how to get ahead in the world. These modern books, maybe you can find them in airports, have titles such as Machiavellianism in the World of Business, or Power Politics According to Machiavelli. But these books miss half of Machiavelli's message, and I think it's the more important half. The message is that even in the world of power politics, liberty is better than tyranny, freedom is better than oppression, religion is often a mask for pragmatic political interests, rule by the people is to be preferred to rule by one man. So 500 years after Machiavelli wrote The Prince, as I said, 500 years practically to the day, this is still a revolutionary thing to say. Thank you. So I think we have at least 5 minutes for questions, and I'm happy to answer questions about any part of the lecture or any examples in The Prince. Does this mean that you're all already Machiavellians at heart, and that the message is completely obvious?